Okay, hello. I just wanted to go through the content integration slides for Serious Games. I hope you're all well and that everything is progressing quite well too. So the Honours project, Serious Games, and I know you had an assessment to be in for Web Games Development too. Now, I apologise for not prancing roundabout as usual because I'm experiencing a bit of technical difficulty with my iPad. It keeps on saying, the storage capacity is full, even though it's not, and it won't let me record anything. So I'm not by my television as I sort of normally am when I'm doing these things. But anyway, I wanted to go through content integration for Serious Games today. I've made a slight alteration to the slides in terms of the coursework. So for content integration, there's a 2.5 mark allocation for that, and 2.5 marks for assessment integration as well. Now, I'll explain exactly what that means and how to pick up the marks and how to possibly potentially pick up extra marks as well. But anyway, content integration is one of the sort of challenges of Serious Games. Of course, when we're talking about Serious Games, we're really talking about pedagogical content and learning content, instructional content, teaching and learning. Not the sort of traditional form of content that we would associate with entertainment games like graphics, AI, characters, vehicles, downloadable content, levels, etc. But we really are sort of looking at the learning content. Now, it is a very large field, really, and I was going to do a literature review many, many years ago on content integration for Serious Games. And I found that it was just far too large. And essentially what I did was I changed that to assessment integration for Serious Games. And that's why you'll see on the My UWS VLE that there are a few assessment integration papers, which was then sort of taken forward by my PhD student at that time. But there's no content integration papers because content integration is just far too wide, unfortunately. But anyway, one of the main challenges of Serious Games, and just to sort of switch to the next slide. So the challenge of content integration is going to be the structure. We'll talk about knowledge and skills. What exactly do we sort of mean by that? In terms of knowledge, we could be talking about procedural, declarative knowledge, metacognitive, strategy formation, general knowledge, that sort of thing. And then when we think of skills, we're really thinking of something different, possibly sort of procedural knowledge more than anything else. So a skill is like playing the piano, for example, or being able to solve a Rubik's Cube, a surgical procedure, a dental procedure. That may be a particular skill that people might want to acquire. And of course, knowledge. So the challenge of actually putting these things, what skills, what knowledge do you actually wish to impart to the player of the game, the learner, after they've actually played the Serious Game or your game that you're going to be developing. So that's one of the sort of key challenges. So we'll look at content in general. So there's a sort of general definition of content. I'm rather embarrassed to say it's from the Oxford English Dictionary, but it sort of covers it slightly well. Content in terms of computer games, which we all sort of know about anyway. Content in Serious Games, so we're really looking at the pedagogical content, the pedagogical underpinnings, the learning, the teaching, that sort of thing. Intrinsic and extrinsic content, this is really what I sort of want you to focus on for the 2.5 mark allocation, so we'll discuss that. I'd like you to actually state what particular kind of content integration you are utilizing for the development of your Serious Game. So whether that's intrinsic content integration, extrinsic content integration, or it can be a combination of the two. You can also look at endogenous and exogenous games. These are really sort of synonymous with those previous terms as well. So specify that as well. It can be both. And also implicit and explicit content as well. So I'll get to that and I'll tell you more or less exactly what to sort of put in there. Also, we'll look at procedural game content, and there's also this thing called content segmentation that I found to be relatively useful in the past, and students in the past have actually used content segmentation in their design section of their Serious Games submission if they were perhaps having a bit of difficulty with coming up with the UML or the sort of standard games design document that people sort of produce. So to focus on the actual learning content, they've actually used this content segmentation, which is actually presented in this slideshow. So we'll also talk about frameworks mentioning content, examples of serious games, so a sort of general example, relevant games in relation to the coursework as well. Okay, so the challenge of content integration. So what content should actually be integrated into a serious game to ensure that the learning outcomes are achieved? Now, when I'm talking to you about your coursework, I have sort of mentioned before that I'm only really wanting 3 to 5 learning outcomes, and these are incredibly concise. So it's all very well sort of saying that I want this game to cover the entire curriculum of advanced higher physics or advanced higher maths, but we're really not looking for that because it's probably not going to be practically possible to cover an entire course in that depth. So we're really looking for very, very small, concise learning outcomes. So one of the game that I developed for my PhD was called the Requirements Collection and Analysis Game, which was absolutely thrilling, I might add. And the learning outcomes for that where the user should have an appreciation of user requirements. The user should have an appreciation of system requirements, or learn about system requirements. The user should learn about domain requirements, conflictions, and be able to sort of resolve those conflictions and get rid of the ambiguity. So really 4 small learning outcomes there, or 3 to 5 learning outcomes. So what kind of knowledge or skills are you hoping to impart with your serious game? Is it knowledge, is it skills, or is it both? So when I say knowledge, procedural, declarative, general, metacognitive skills are of course a bit of a different thing. And there are a few studies on games considering the notion of actually encapsulating content. And I've given a reference here from 2010, and I sort of suspect it's because it's entirely too large a field and too large of a problem to integrate a lot of learning content into serious games. So I've presented here, this is a sort of diagram from a paper that is looking at content integration associated with a serious game for learning about police procedures during an accident. So as you can see from there, there are sort of benefits and advantages in terms of learning associated with games in general. So you get knowledge and skills, attitude perhaps, and in terms of being physical and mental. And also in computer games, you have benefits or potential cognitive impacts and outcomes, that sort of thing. So you get hand-eye coordination, learning procedures, mental rotation, knowledge acquisition, retention, self-esteem. And then when you move into things like serious games, you've got foreign language and culture, tactical experience, post-traumatic stress disorder. In terms of education, when you're looking at pedagogy, you get mathematics, history, physics, politics, writing. In terms of emergency services, you've got handling hazardous material, perhaps healthcare, procedural skills, therapy, remission's one of the games that was sort of mentioned before. You've got other things as well. For example, driving game, leadership, management. And in terms of the police game that they're particularly looking at, you've got decision making, disasters, and crimes. Now, I've included that in there so that if you're actually looking for references associated with your serious game in terms of the narrative and the introduction, small, tiny literature review that I've sort of asked for, you might actually find that there are many references in there that you can potentially use, whether the games are similar or perhaps that they're entirely more or less trying to achieve the same goal. Or if you're looking at it from an honours dissertation perspective, it could very well be that you could use some of these references. So you can go back to that paper, you can look up these references, and you've got some narrative anyway. So that's trying to be a bit useful there. So in terms of the challenge, why use a serious game to begin with? You've got to actually justify that the topic is suitable for a serious game. It might not actually be cost effective, or it might not be the most sort of viable option to teach a subject through a serious game. So you've got to identify the instructional problems, particularly with the traditional teaching approaches, and describe what a serious game can provide that other training methods cannot. Now, that is generally quite easy. I mean, you are looking at the interactivity, the ability to rehearse these particular procedures, perhaps. And of course, you have very, very little risk in terms of risk in real life. So things like that. Those are the advantages, really. Challenge 2, embedding the sound learning and instructional principles, the pedagogical underpinnings, the teaching and learning, how that actually manages to sort of come from traditional teaching and learning principles as well, and how to reconcile the two opposite view camps in terms of you've got the entertaining fun side of games, but you've also got the instructional, educational side, and trying to marry those two things up is very, very difficult. And why, even though I do sort of teach a course in serious games, why I've always been perpetually, eternally skeptical. And that's okay, because that is a very, very difficult thing to do. And then you've got to try and prove the learning effectiveness in relation to traditional teaching approaches as well, which once again requires a good, probably RCT or experimental study. The next thing is development. What particular game engine? Because of the advancement of computer games development and computer games technology in general, in terms of engines and things like that, I mean, you can fire out games right, left, and center. They're more easy. They're easier to create now than ever. What sort of fidelity are you looking at in terms of simulation, graphical fidelity, realism, that sort of thing? But also, what sort of content, how does the content actually get integrated into that in terms of dialogue, in terms of the pedagogical sort of content as well, in terms of assets, artwork, assessment, we will look at next week, because there's 2.5 marks associated with assessment integration in the coursework as well. So that's really the challenge of content integration. So in terms of what is content, here's one from the definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, and it's the things that are held or included in something quelle surprise. So information made available by a website or other electronic medium, that's another sort of definition, but content is often used colloquially to refer to media. So however, content is more accurately used as a specific term, and then it means the content of the medium rather than the medium itself. So basically, things that are held or included in something. Not exactly brilliant definition, but there we are. But in terms of content for serious games, we're looking at the learning content. It has increased importance because it is a game for education and training purposes. Okay, so in terms of learning content, it could be procedural, declarative, general, implicit or explicit. It could be text, puzzles, tests, skills, feedback, that sort of thing. What about the pedagogical underpinnings, the learning outcomes, the 3 to 5 statements that we've sort of talked about? And what about making that game generic? That's another slight problem as well, because you can make a game, but then of course it can be sort of slightly stuck in time, unless of course you have a games developer that can alter these things. Now, in terms of making a game generic, how do you actually then allow someone the ability to come along, like an educator or a teacher or whatever, to come along and alter the content of that game as they see fit for their own educational purposes? Now, I do have a sort of example of a dialogue editor that a French student once helped me implement. Well, he implemented it, I merely sort of supervised. He was a sort of stage student that came for a sort of 12-week period, and was able to implement a dialogue editor for the game for my PhD called Philippe. So that was good. So I'll talk about that a little bit. So what is content? I don't want to belabor the point here. We kind of know what content is in terms of computer games and video games in general. So we're talking about things like physics, AI, graphics, sound, gameplay, story, narrative, user interfaces, menus, cuts, scenes, that sort of thing. Even advertisements. I seem to remember this F1 racing game that my flatmate was obsessed with back in 2011. And when he was going around the track, always kept me up to the small hours of the morning with him going around this track for about 5 minutes. But the track was littered with advertisements. And there was actually a PhD student at the university that did his entire PhD on advert games. And it's a sort of interesting sort of thing where, I mean, if you're subjected to adverts, you know, trying to get you to drink Coca-Cola all the time as you go around the course, will you then come out of that game and will it result in behavioural change where you go, I want Coca-Cola right now? But we have had that sort of thing in the past. The UWS and advertisements are, of course, a big part of gaming as well. You get things like downloadable content, which is very, very commonplace for PCs and mobile games nowadays. Plants vs. Zombies is one of my favourites. It's always constantly downloading stuff, new levels, new zombies, new plants, that sort of thing, new characters. Hungry Shark Evolution is another one of my favourites that I've always sort of played, and you can download new sharks. The Great White Shark is not the best shark anymore. You can download all these sort of new levels, new sharks, new things. And there's just some sort of examples. I seem to remember there's a sort of Grand Theft Auto patch thing where you can go around as Magneto from the X-Men and move the metal. Love it. That sort of thing. But I'd imagine that's probably just the tip of the iceberg when it's Grand Theft Auto. Plants vs. Zombies, all these characters, all these levels as well. The Sims, I think that is The Sims. But anyway, you get the idea. Lots of downloadable content in terms of levels, campaigns, quests. There's some examples there. Game mode, rule sets, songs for Guitar Hero or whatever. Equipment, clothing, characters, vehicles, cheats, boosts. So that's how we generally think of content in terms of games for entertainment. But in terms of content for serious games, let's have a look at this guy, Clark Aldrich, who's the CEO and founder of Simulearn. And he also wrote a book, he's written a couple of books actually, and one of them's called Learning by Doing. It's in the reference section at the end of this lecture. And he defines content as, well, he categorizes it into the following different kinds. So you get linear content, which is much like a movie. You start off, it's a predefined path from beginning to end, and hopefully you do learn something. You've got cyclical content, which addresses really sort of small, repetitive tasks and activities that, when they're combined, they can impact the environment. You've then got the system content, and that's more complex, intertwined relationships, and the rules and principles that sort of govern the operation of a system. Then you've got open-ended that presents a subject with no rule set experience. The game rarely repeats the sort of same situation twice. Right and wrong is really sort of removed from the equation somewhat, and there's a great deal of sort of experimentation. So that's how he sort of categorizes content. Okay. He also says that serious games have elements of all these things. So you've got simulation, game elements, and pedagogical elements. And they, of course, combine there when you actually see them sort of merging in the center. You actually get sort of story and narrative, or the sort of content of the game in the sort of center there. Okay, they have all those elements. In terms of intrinsic and extrinsic content, you'll see the reference at the bottom there, Gomez, Martin, and Gonzalez. I can't see from my own sort of image there, but that's actually in Professor Conley's book at the end, and they categorize these different forms of content, which are intrinsic content, so intrinsic game content and extrinsic game content. So intrinsic content integration is really where the learning content is integrated within the framework of the game. And the learning and the gaming are very, very closely related. So if you think of something like the requirements collection and analysis game, which I'll probably show you at some stage, you're running round about an organization trying to get the requirements from various individuals. And then, of course, if those requirements sort of conflict, you then go up the hierarchy and you try to resolve the ambiguity. So the learning and the gaming are very, very sort of closely related, and both happen simultaneously. So that's really intrinsic content integration. Extrinsic content integration is really where the learning and the gaming are independent activities. So you might actually have some form of game and that's all fine. But then the learning takes place in a quiz out with the game, and it's sort of built upon successful game mechanics, but it is a sort of separate thing. Now, these categories are not an either or, but really a continuum of possible options and can complement each other depending on the sort of different content styles, different learning styles, that sort of thing. So basically what I want you to sort of do for your coursework for the 2.5 marks that are specified in the coursework specification is to actually state whether you're using intrinsic content integration or extrinsic content integration, or perhaps a combination of both. So that's a sort of example, and justify why that's the case, and say we are utilizing intrinsic content integration because the game is really about requirements collection, where you're navigating an organization in order to capture the requirements to formulate a requirements specification, something like that. So specify what kind it is and justify why you're actually saying that about it as well. Now, I don't want you to get confused with intrinsic motivation there. It's a sort of different thing, but it can be achieved through fantasy and the following kinds of games. So you get endogenous educational games. And this is where the gameplay is informed by the learning content and the sort of pedagogical theory, and that's all fine. So that is basically synonymous with intrinsic content integration from the previous slide. It's basically the same thing. Exogenous educational games, the learning content is added on top of a successful game mechanic without significant modification. So that's really extrinsic content integration. So it would be quite nice if you could specify intrinsic, extrinsic content integration, endogenous or exogenous educational games, and then say which particular ones you're utilizing, or which particular ones your serious game actually is. And yeah, that's sort of what I want there. You can also specifically state whether it's implicit or explicit content. There's not an awful lot on this, to be perfectly honest, and these are in fact the definitions from that 2010 paper. So explicit is text, image, video. Implicit rules, implicit are rules and constraints and strategies. As the name sort of suggests, these things are implicitly, you become intuitively sort of aware of them regardless. So that's what I sort of want you to state. Either intrinsic, extrinsic content integration, or both, exogenous or endogenous games, or both, or explicit and implicit, or both, and say, you know, why that is the case. So state what they are and justify it, and then of course you'll get your 2.5 marks. As long as you use intrinsic and extrinsic content integration in terms of terminology, I'm happy. Okay. Procedural game content, you get things like AI, sound, space, in terms of game material, and these things are generated during the game's runtime. We had a very sort of successful entry this year for Transfuser by a group of computer games development students, and they came up with a game called Tribulation, which was very, very impressive in terms of procedural content. It was procedural level generation, and it was actually excellent. I mean, and that's of course relying on sort of fabricated elements, in this case, the levels. So that's that. But if you're wanting to sort of maximize marks perhaps, or you're having difficulty with the design document as such, which I believe is only 15 marks. So I think I wanted 5 marks for the 3 to 5 learning outcomes, 10 marks for the sort of narrative with the 5 references that are sort of examples of the type of CDS game that you're actually wanting to come up with, either academic examples or real game examples or whatever, preferably both. And then there's another 10% for the sort of design, and you can use content in that part. Then there's 2.5 marks for content integration and 2.5 marks for assessment integration. So very, very easy in that sense, but you can use content segmentation in the design section if you so desire. So here's content segmentation. So studies show that an appropriate balance between game time and learning time is really needed to sort of maintain motivation. So content segmentation, in general, educational game designers follow these particular steps. You've got to determine the subject content to teach according to the general learning objective and the population, or the target population. Define the major content segments to specific learning objectives and the target population, and describe the content elements in relation to the specific objectives. And the larger segments form some form of a table or a flowchart, and formulate questions or items for every element associated with these. Okay. So that's content segmentation. Now this is part of a sort of larger framework. It's merely a small section in a larger framework, but that's how to sort of come up with the segments. Now here is an example of coming up with segments for a game to teach about STIs, or sexually transmitted infections. I know quite a few people that could possibly have benefited from this, I can tell you. But okay, so you've got a segment for prevention, information about how to break the STI cycle of transmission, prevalence, the state of the situation, on the number infected or carrying the STI, perhaps transmission, how it's actually sexually transmitted, the various infections, and treatment, how to actually cure these particular STIs as well. So that's you know, an example of how you can create the particular content segments if you so desire, and you can do that for your serious game if you want. People have sort of reached for the stars in previous courseworks in previous years, because it is honours year and everyone is attempting to get as many marks as possible in order to get the best distinction in order to secure a future, etc. So you can use this if you so desire. Now, as I sort of said, you can see the content segmentation is part of a sort of larger framework there. Now those 4 points, and for some bizarre reason, when I'm actually recording this, I can't go back in the goddamn slides, which is a bit of a shame. But 2 slides prior to this, I showed you these, or maybe 3 slides prior to this, I showed you these 3 particular points, which was determine the subject content to teach according to the general objective, define the major content segments, describe the content elements in relation to the specific objectives in larger segments, and formulate questions or items for each content element. Okay, so that's the content segmentation part, and it is part of this sort of larger framework. So you've got repetition, content segmentation, feedback, and reinforcement. So you can sort of use that if you wish. Okay. So here's some frameworks mentioning content. Now the thing about frameworks in games or serious games, whether it's associated with content integration, assessment integration, or evaluation of serious games, you'll notice that these frameworks, and frameworks in general probably in academia, are generally quite abstract, and as a result don't go into a great degree of specificity, I would say. Now I've actually come up with my own evaluation framework, which I've got to say is actually quite famous. It's got me lots of publications, which is quite nice, and the reason that actually happened is because I, instead of just formulating a sort of abstract framework, I went into the details of how individual factors were in fact measured, and I could quote a reference for nearly over 78, I looked at 78 papers, and I can quote a reference for all of these particular measurements and how they were in fact measured. So when people are saying, how do I measure this, you can look at that as a reference, which was a utterly brilliant idea at the time. At least it felt like it. And it was a lot of work. But as I say, the rest of these frameworks tend to be high levels of abstraction, and you can see that as an example here. You've got content and pedagogy and learning and teaching, but that's all it really tells you. It doesn't really go into a great deal of detail. And if you're looking at that, you're thinking, okay, it's lovely, but I mean, where do I start? I mean, it's not an excellent starting point. It's just a sort of abstract, higher level framework for us to sort of work from. So you've got to sort of formulate everything from there. That being said, you do need a sort of general framework for these things, because if you were to go into the specifics of it, it would then lose its sort of generalization, I would suppose, if that makes sense. So yes, there's a sort of example of one that mentions content. Now here's another one, the classroom games design framework, which is actually quite fun because it splits it into the ludic dimension and the educational dimension. So we've got game elements, including mechanics, story, technology, and aesthetics, but we've also got the educational dimension, which utilizes Bloom's taxonomy from lecture 2, learning theories and models, or whatever it was. So I mean, I remember sort of going through Bloom's taxonomy then, and we had the cognitive domain, the affective domain, and the psychomotor domain as well. So the affective domain was emotions, psychomotor was sort of movement, of course. And of course, we have the cognitive domain, and this actually addresses the cognitive domain, which is nice from a recognized framework from a famous academic. So we have the cognitive processes, remembering, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating, that sort of thing. Then the types of knowledge, factual, conceptual, metacognitive, procedural. The pedagogical model, that's going to be face-to-face. And the supporting technology. And I've got to say, I think I'm going to use this later on because I'm not entirely certain that the asynchronous pedagogical model is working for this program. And I think we'll possibly have to revise that before we lose a lot of people. So I think it's possibly best to have a look at that. But I'm going to use this framework in an argument that I'm going to make to higher management later, I think. But never mind. Educational dimension, we're using Bloom's taxonomy, which is excellent. Now, this particular framework goes into quite a lot of detail. So you get the educational game design methodology framework, which is quite nice. Baby. So that goes into a great deal of detail. So you've got the planning, the prototype stage, and finalizing. Now you can see from the prototyping stage that it does look quite iterative in a sense. It looks like a sort of agile methodology where you're sort of going around in an iterative circle until you get what you sort of want. And that looks like the agile method and various other sort of software development methodologies, perhaps the spiral model, for example, but that's a sort of traditional model. Let's have a look at the plan. You're defining the learning objectives and design goals. You've got to understand the learners, identify the learning activities and objectives, etc. Sequence learning activities in increasing complexity order or order of complexity. Design the story to set the scene and link learning activities that are defined in the identification process. And then you're going into the prototyping stage, which is iterative, as I've said, and you go around in as many iterations until you get the game that you're actually, or the level that you're wanting out of the playtesting phase. So you can design the game mechanics, design the game components and associated behaviors, design the scenarios and the gameplay for learning activities defined in 3, 4, and 5. Then you're prototyping the game level, evaluating the prototype against the learning objectives, and hopefully, if all is well, then you can move on to stage 12. If not, then you're refining the level. So finalization is you're more or less producing the educational game, and then you're moving to the testing phase, which is kind of weird, but never mind. You're integrating all the developed levels into a single sort of thing. So that's a lot of detail, but it's still quite a good sort of educational game design methodology proposed by Tang and Hannigan and Tim. Now, excuse me, they proposed the following guidelines for embedding pedagogical content into gameplay. it has to be in line with the defined learning objectives and accessible. Has to be an increasing order of difficulty and achievable in the form of an intellectual exercise with minimal abstractions. So hopefully that's reasonably straightforward. Applicable and readily transferable to the real world. Carefully balanced, and achievement should be based on Weir's attribution theory, which is quite interesting. And learners should be given feedback so as to recognize success and errors. Excellent. So more of these should be embedded within the storytelling and narrative components of the game whenever possible. Use multiple representations where appropriate and be concise, but avoid oversimplification. You've got to sort of have a little chuckle at some of these guidelines because you're thinking to yourself, that sounds incredibly simplistic, straightforward, and common sense. But when you actually read it, you're thinking, wow, that is very, very difficult to pull off, as many of these guidelines, abstract guidelines from these frameworks are. So it's a bit like saying, the game has to be able to teach people, but be motivational and fun. You can't really guarantee it, and it's very, very difficult to do. So never mind, we'll sort of move on from that. Contain challenges allowing learners to apply acquired knowledge and thus increase retention, fair enough. Not to have more than 7 key concepts. So that's in relation to chunking, which I believe we sort of looked at the learning and theories and models lecture 2 as well. So that's in order to promote appropriate information recall. So excellent stuff. Right. Other frameworks that sort of mention content. Van Eck 2007 presents examples of 9 events from games based on Gagner's instructional design. So you get things like this. These are the 9 events down the left-hand side, and the examples of 9 events in various different sort of guises are on the right-hand side. Okay, so you're gaining attention in form of objective, recall prior knowledge, present instruction, provide guidance, and this can be done through motion cut scenes, character speech, health meters, attacks, death, documentation, obstacles, movement, interaction, environmental cues, events from earlier in the game, and then, of course, presenting instruction. That can be all of the above. Cutscenes, NPCs, playable characters, and then, of course, they've got to be able to advance. So essentially, advancing in the game is more or less assessment, and it does sort of prove that the information or the knowledge has been retained. Okay, providing practice, so the players can't progress through the game without demonstrating they know or think they know all the knowledge that is demonstrated. You're providing feedback, and that can be through character speech again. The player gets past the obstacle or achieves a goal or does not, etc. Then assessing performance. Moving through the game is assessment. So we will be looking at assessment integration next week, and I'm sure it's going to fascinate you because content integration, let's face it, is going to be worth 2.5 marks. Assessment integration is going to be worth 2.5 marks. But don't worry, evaluation is worth about 20 marks in this assessment, so it will be fine. And we'll get through it, okay? Enhancing retention and transfer as well. So we'll talk about assessment next week. So those are some frameworks that mention content. Now here's the sort of police example. Now this was back in 2009 when this paper was in fact written. So this is in fact a bunch of photographs taken of an accident, and this is probably one of the most direct examples of content integration that I can actually see, where they went around and they photographed everything and then they put it straight into a game. And then we've sort of practically tried to do that at some stage ourselves. However, we'll tackle this one first. So there we have an accident. You receive the accident call, you travel to the accident, you contact the operations room for further assistance, you secure the scene with traffic cones, attend the injured, identify and question the people at the scene, whatever. Search for clues, mark the clues. This is probably the most detailed accident scene I've ever seen in my life. Take photographs, take measurements, draw the accident scene, oh God. Collaborate with paramedics and collaborate with the truck operator. So that's all fine. That's how they decided to sort of gather the content requirements for this particular game. And then they decided just to more or less computerize it. So yeah, So that's what it sort of looks like when you put it straight into the computer. The ultimate example of content integration, I would say. Very, very happy with it, to be honest. Now, years ago in 2013, 2014, perhaps, it probably was. Anyway, we decided to do a simulated practice game for nursery practitioners. And we had a Unity developer and we had an animator that were in the Scottish Centre for Enabling Technologies group within the university. And we had all this, so we went and took pictures of nurseries, etc. And this is the story of the content that sort of went into this simulated practice game. Now, we had a whole load of nursery practitioners that had to tell us basically what the sort of policies were, and these were some of them. So communication, knowing how to adapt the way you communicate, understand ways in which children may use play to communicate perhaps, know how to support children to cope with their feelings as well, well-being and resilience, understanding ways to encourage emotional well-being, confidence and resilience, understand ways of encouraging children to make choices so that they understand the effect those choices have on other children, etc. Know how to adapt your practice to ensure that all children can take part equally. Health and safety, understand different kinds of incidents and emergencies that might arise in a childcare setting, understand how to support children during an emergency or whatever, and understand how to summon assistance appropriate to these situations. Now, in terms of the content, we had a whole load of scripts, we had a whole load of scenarios. We had a number of children issues that would arise during the course of the game. The child has slipped, for example, sustained a minor injury. A guardian is picking up a child. A child doesn't want to wear an eye patch, that sort of thing. So in terms of the graphics, we went round and we took photographs of nurseries, and we had an animator that made a brilliant job of sort of putting it all together, and the programmer, again, a brilliant job. In terms of the sounds, we had children actually come into the university, and we had them, say the little pieces of dialogue into microphones, and we recorded everything, and that's how the sound content actually get put into the game. It's quite an interesting day that day. Stressful but interesting. So that's how we sort of did all of that. So a lot of content went into that game, and it was incredibly successful. It was a sort of project for the NHS, I believe, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe I'm talking rubbish. But it was a big sort of project at the time for us. Okay. Another example is the requirements collection and analysis game that I implemented for my PhD. Now, in order to make that content generic, we decided to build a dialogue editor. Well, I decided to build a dialogue editor, which I didn't really have time for, so I enlisted the help of this little stage student from France called Philippe, who's still my database book, by the way. He still has it. Database systems, he's buggered off with it. But anyway, never mind. So he came up with this dialogue editor, which basically had 4 files with XML tags in it. So it had a sort of content file containing the dialogue, the questions, the requirements, and the tools, and then the group's object name, default greeting, that sort of thing. And whether a question could be answered, whether the dialogue could be unlocked or whatever, or if the dialogue was unlocked. Office NPCs and Office objects, and the Office NPCs were going about in a little particular path, and that's all fair enough. So to make it look as if they were running about, and then there was objects that you can access as well. So that then manifested itself to a sort of dialogue editor a bit like this. And as you can see there, there's requirements which are in green. We have, is that, can't quite see it. Oh yes, the objects are in red and the to-dos are in blue. So you had all of these things that could be more or less intermingled within the dialogue, which was really quite something, and he did a very, very good job of it. So that is an example of one entire project, an entire 12-week project, that was actually just about making a particular game that looked a bit like The Sims, generic in terms of content integration. Okay. So methods of content integration. Content integration can be handled in a number of ways. I mean, you can have the files, you can have XML, object orientation, whatever you want. But the primary goal is really to design a structure and series of search algorithms to make interaction look a bit effortless in that particular scenario, because you're also teaching some soft skills and that sort of thing within that game. We'll talk about that game later. Anywho, for ideas about content, it depends what particular game you're wanting to develop for your serious game. But I know that some people are looking at programming games, software engineering games, math games, language games, and programming games, etc. So I've put some games that you can actually look at on here. So for software project management, you can look at SimJava SB, The Incredible Manager, the KM Quest, SimSE, which is a very sort of simplistic game, SimVBSE. Open Software Solutions is an interesting example of a serious game, because essentially it was a terrible game. Well, it wasn't particularly engaging, but it was considered to be quite a successful one because it was distributed to almost about 1,000 people or 1,000 students. So it was actually more cost effective just to simply distribute this game with the learning content on it. But it wasn't really a particularly great game, didn't receive rave reviews, that sort of thing. But anyway, these are trade-offs that you've got to sort of consider when coming up with educational games, if educational games in fact exist. So Math, Zombie Division, Phoenix Quest, Smile, math games online. I know that quite a few students in the class, Aidan for example, are doing maths games. So have a look at those if you want. Language learning, there's someone else that wanted to do sort of a language learning game, if memory serves. So have a look at Tactical Iraqi, EverQuest, Tower of Babel. And programming games, so the Alice Project, Muppets, Woo's Castle, and Lumino. Do have a look at these. Okay, so here's an example of a game in retail. So you have the McDonald's game there, and this customer has a particular issue. So this is to help people, learn how to sort of survive in retail, I suppose. So the customer has an issue. I'm upset that the food is taking so long and the soda machine is out of Coke. Oh, God. So that's all fun. I don't like McDonald's because every single time I go in there, not that I've been in there for years, because watching my health, etc. I turn 40 on Friday, so I think a McDonald's would probably kill me or go straight to my thighs. Anyway, you go into McDonald's and you point at something, and they always make you say, "Oh, that please, that right there. What is he wanting? It's a McChicken sandwich, McChicken." You've always got to say Mc or McFlurry or whatever. So I absolutely hate it. And the food is phenomenally healthy, I suppose. It's not food that I would normally stuff down my throat. However, this is to in these potential answers, there are 2 that are sort of diplomatically okay, and 2 that are phenomenally 100% wrong. So you'll say, "I'll comp your food," which McDonald's doesn't want. The other one is, "I'll get someone to bring you your drink," so that's quite diplomatic, quite nice. How long have you been waiting? It makes it look as if you're actually a bit concerned and you're trying to, probe the customer about their particular troubles, so that looks quite diplomatic. And your food will be here in just a minute, and you walk off, so that's a recalcitrant screw you sort of reaction, and you're not wanting that either. So you can see that there's a sort of meters there associated with customer satisfaction, anger level, that sort of thing. Now, if you've done a sort of perhaps menial job, like I don't know, working in Asda or shelf replenishment or whatever. I worked in Asda in 2009, and because Walmart actually has more money than God, they decided to bombard us with all this sort of multimedia training. And it was quite funny in a sense, because you watched all of this, you were subjected to these scenarios, and then of course you had to select a particular course of action or a way forward. And essentially, as far as I can tell, every single option always led to you telling a supervisor, or you telling a manager, or telling someone that it was really none of their business. But you had to spill your guts all the time about every aspect of your life to these people in the sort of managerial hierarchy, perhaps. And I remember there's one scenario where it was this girl who's going, oh no, went to a party the weekend, we get very, very drunk and then we kissed, but now he won't stop texting me. What do I do? Tell a supervisor, tell a manager, tell. And that seemed to be the sort of main point of it. Anyway, retail games. So there's a sort of example of that. So that's perfectly acceptable for your serious game as well. Seen all of that in the past. We'll talk about retail games next week in terms of assessment integration. Now, in terms of the coursework, you've got 2.5 marks associated with this. I know it's a big long lecture for that, but anyway, there we go. I did say that all the coursework and marks would be revealed during the course of the lectures, and I did not lie to you. So you have to specify whether the content is implicit, explicit, intrinsic, extrinsic, or a combination of both, perhaps. They are a continuum and not mutually exclusive, so you can say that the game we're going to utilize intrinsic content integration because the game is, or extrinsic, or perhaps both, or whatever, just as long as you can justify it. What I'm really looking for is use of the terminology intrinsic content integration or extrinsic content integration. So make sure that you mention that. The next thing is endogenous and exogenous, and why. Basically, endogenous is synonymous with intrinsic and exogenous is synonymous with extrinsic, and basically they're sort of slightly the same thing, more or less. You may mention frameworks and perhaps content segmentation if you wish to maximize marks in the design section, and that's if you're sort of out of ideas, but as a sort of people have done it in the past and it has worked out rather well for them. Only if you want to do so, but as an idea. Okay. Right, here are the references that I sort of used in the presentation. So you've got Clark Aldrich, the first two references there at the top, Learning by Doing. That's his book, A Comprehensive Guide to Simulations. I've read that cover to cover. Simulations and the Future of Learning, also sort of read that slightly. And there's that paper, Serious Games for the Police. So that's the sort of police example that I was showing you, and it also had that sort of framework with the serious games, computer games, educational games, healthcare games, therapy games, and police games. That was sort of bubbly circular framework at the beginning. So have a look at that. Gomez, and Gonzalez Calero. Oh yeah, sorry, before that there's a framework for the design and integration of collaborative classroom games, so that's one of those fabulous frameworks. And then the content integration that actually references the terminology intrinsic and extrinsic content integration. That's in that paper there in 2009 in Thomas Conley and Mark Stanfield and Elizabeth Boyle's book. And that was in Games-Based Learning Advancement for Multisensory Human-Computer Interfaces, Techniques and Effective Systems. What a title. I can't believe they picked that. Anyway, never mind. Then you've got Pablo Moreno Gel, and he's talking about XML content integration. I believe he came up with a game called eAdventure, or a sort of game engine called eAdventure, and it uses XML for the content integration. Okay, next we have Designing Procedural Game Space as a case study. I forget what that's about. Effective digital games as well. So that's a group of heuristics principles, perhaps. Then Tang and Hannigan, designing educational games. So that's that sort of large framework, that rather detailed framework that I showed you, with the sort of iterative prototype sort of methodology in the middle. Yes, similar to the Agile model, the spiral model. Okay. So do have a look at that if you want. Then you've got Van Eck, who uses Gagner's, where's Gagner? Oh yes, Gagner 1965 is there. Conditions of learning, his particular framework, and mentions content and assessment and integration as well, or assessment. And then you get the design, play, and experience framework as well at the bottom. So that should really be all of the references. Now you can use that in terms of the narrative, I suppose, associated with the introduction section, serious game that you're going to create. But also you can use it if you're doing a sort of honours project in serious games. I'm not sure that many of you are, but it's a possibility as well. However, that's everything really. I just wanted to be absolutely clear about how to get the marks, the 2.5 marks. So make sure that you absolutely 100% mention intrinsic content integration or extrinsic content integration. And I've had conversations like this with people in the past, and I've made it perfectly clear, if you do not mention it, I will not give you the 2.5 marks. And it's amazing how some people do not mention it, and then all of a sudden they're stunned when 2.5 marks get deducted from their coursework. So I'm just telling you all now. I have told you, it's in a recording, it's cool. So intrinsic or extrinsic content integration should be in there, and you'll get 2.5 marks. It is as simple as that. I'm not lying, I swear to goodness. Right, okay, so next week we'll look at assessment integration. And also I've got a nice little sort of surprise in terms of testing a Serious Game app in order to engender empathy during a pandemic, which will be quite interesting for you to look at. So hopefully everything's okay, and if you have any questions, then email me or call me. All right, later.